Good to see you all this morning. And let's see. Yep, PowerPoint's up there. So by the way, Tim and Janet are in Wisconsin. So 35 years ago, they planted a church in Wisconsin, and they have invited them back this weekend to speak and celebrate at what God's done. When Tim and Janet left, the guy that they had take over the church is still there 35 years later, which is a big deal. So, so that's way cool what's happening there. So I'm going to talk this morning about failure and messes and problems. And guess what? Oftentimes, messes will lead to relational problems. And so what we're going to look at today is the life of Peter. And it's interesting that Peter, who's the church's first leader, is in the Gospels kind of highlighted as the guy that massively messed up and fell on his face the most. And so what we're going to see is Peter thought he was really big stuff, and he thought he was like beyond failing, and then he just fell flat on his face. So it's no accident that the Gospels really zero in on the life of Peter so that we can learn about how Peter had to deal with his own failure, how it affected his relationship with Jesus, and kind of what all was maybe behind that, some aspects of spiritual warfare and all kinds of things. There's a lot going in this study of that we kind of see through the lens of Peter. So let's see if I can get the technology to work here. Turn it on first. Okay, helpful tip. There we go. All right. So it all starts with the dispute. All right, so mostly what this is, the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And so we start here in Luke 22, that there's this, I don't know what was going on in the disciples' mind, but they might have kind of figured out, like, hey, this might be the end, and maybe Jesus, what he said he's going to go, we don't really believe that he's going to go away, but just in case he does, who's going to be in charge? Because everybody wanted to be in charge, and probably especially Peter. So this dispute rose among them as to which of them was regarded as the greatest. And so Jesus, actually, this had happened over and over again in the Gospels. I mean, this is like a reoccurring theme, this power play of who's the greatest. And so Jesus says, okay, let's go over this again. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them. Those who have the authority over them are called benefactors. But it's not this way with you. The one who is the greatest among you must be like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. So each of these men really sincerely thought they were like the best thing ever. And Jesus is trying to say, okay, that's not the way I do. That's not how things are done in the kingdom. So he's addressing this issue that he's been trying to get through to him and hasn't been very successful. So he's confronting him once again on their attitude. And then, why is it not working now? Oh, okay, there we go. So, but he continues, even though he confronts them on this blind spot that they have, he turns right around and says, you are those who have stood by me in my trials. Now, actually, this is kind of funny because pretty soon he's going to say, all of you are going to desert me. But right now he's saying, hey, you've stood by me. And just as the Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and that you will sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So in the same conversation, Jesus is addressing their brokenness, but he's also saying, but you guys are amazing, and I'm honoring you and telling you of what your role is going to be. And so one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about in the last few months is how in each of us there's brokenness and glory. Simultaneously. So it's not that we're all good or that we're all bad, that in each of us, both things are going on at the same time. And this is a perfect example. You know, they're like demonstrating their brokenness and like being proud and thinking that they've got it all together. And then he says, but you're glorious and I'm gonna honor you for that. Okay. So this is the next verse in Luke 22. And this next section here is really the crux of what I want to talk about here. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail, and you, once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. But Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go to both prison and death. And in John's gospel, it says Peter said to him, I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. One is Satan has demanded permission. So this is interesting. You know, in the book of Job, it talks about how Satan actually came and had this discussion with God and said, listen, I want to tempt Job, and if he gives up all these blessings, that he'll curse you. And so Satan and God had this discussion, and God actually gave Satan permission to cause all this hardship. I mean, this is like a hard thing to hold and understand. But so now, evidently, Satan's a little bolder, and he's demanding something. He says, I demand that you let me at Peter. And interestingly, Jesus said, okay, I'm going to let you do that. And so there is this element going on that we're going to see played out in a little bit of spiritual warfare, where Satan is going to do a full-on attack of Peter. And usually how Satan attacks us is through our weaknesses. If there's a weakness or an unhealed wound or a judgment or bitterness or something like, he'll just go where we're weak and he'll exploit that. And so that's, so Peter is being set up to get a full-on attack by Satan here. And that definitely enters into what's going to happen here. So just kind of a lesson learned is that when people are going through things, and what we're going to see is Peter did really mess up, But before we're too hard on somebody else, maybe there's something more going on here. Maybe they're experiencing full-on spiritual warfare, and that's entering in. And if it was you or I that was getting attacked like that, who knows what we would do. So that does enter into this whole thing. And specifically, his job is to sift him as wheat. And so when you have the wheat and the chaff together and you do this sifting process, you find out where the chaff is, and that the whole purpose of sifting wheat is to reveal and get rid of the chaff. So the interesting thing is, Jesus is actually giving Peter a heads up before it happens about what's going on here. And he says basically, okay, so remember, there's this dispute about who was great, and I'm guessing that Peter's voice may have been the loudest voice in the room about how great he thought he was. And now he's going to be sifted, and his chaff is going to be revealed. This is kind of what Jesus is giving him a heads up. This is what's going to happen. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So what we're going to see is that Peter did deny Jesus 3 times, and yet what Jesus said is your faith will not fail. So even though Peter is going to mess up, in the end, his faith is not going to falter. So just because we make a mistake, that mistake doesn't define us. In this whole story of the Garden of Gethsemane, which I'm going to skip over today, I might pick that up another time. Jesus said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So he's recognizing that okay, there's glory and brokenness in us. There is the spirit that's willing, that's glorious. There's our flesh that messes up. And so just because Peter is about to blow it doesn't define him. And he says, in the end, you're going to come back, you're going to have faith, and you are going to be shown who you really are. And this is interesting. And you, once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. So here we have the leader of the church held up as an example of this massive failure. And God is saying, and your job then is to lead out of your weakness. And just as you have blown it, that's going to help you be more tender with other people when they make mistakes. And I'm going to use this mistake that you've made for good, that you're going to be able to share your story with others and strengthen them. So what we're seeing here is that Jesus wasn't bothered by us blowing it. It's like he's telling them all of this stuff in advance because he's just saying, this is part of life. Failure, mistakes, messing up, it's what we do as humans. And I think Jesus is okay with that. And that's basically what this is a case study for. Okay, here's Peter's response about Jesus telling him he's going to mess up. Oh no. He says, Lord, I am ready to go to prison and death. I got this. And Jesus goes, will you? Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. Okay. So, then, let's fast forward. They've just had the Last Supper. They finished the Last Supper after singing a hymn, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." But Peter said to him, "Even though all may fall away because of you," I can just see him pointing his finger at everybody else, "I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly, I say to you, that this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Okay, so Jesus said this once this evening already, right? And it seems like they didn't get it. So he thought, I tell you what, I'm going to say this to you guys a second time. You're all going to fall away. But Peter knows better than Jesus, right? Jesus is sadly mistaken, and Peter knows better than him. So, kind of reminds me of another time he told Jesus that he was right and he was wrong. Again, brokenness and glory. This is right after, in Matthew 16, you are Peter, the rock, and upon this rock I'm going to build the church. It's like I'm honoring you. This is this wonderful thing about you. And then, by the way, I'm going to be crucified. And Peter rebukes Jesus. And he says, may it never be. And then Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. So you'd kind of think that maybe Peter would have tried to take on Jesus last time, but I don't know. Some of us, like me, are just pretty slow learners. So, and then in Mark, he says, Peter kept saying insistently, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And all the rest were saying the same thing. Okay, so isn't this interesting? So the disciples, and especially Peter, sincerely, they said, we've got good hearts, have good intentions, and we just can't see ourselves doing something bad like denying you. But just because they made that assessment of themselves didn't necessarily mean that that's where they were at. So they had a blind spot. They couldn't see themselves correctly. Let's go back to the first passage we looked at. There's just a dispute. Which of them is the greatest? It's human nature to just be enamored with our greatness, right? That's human nature. And we can be blind to defects and shortcomings in us. And it seems like that's really what was going on here. And Jesus was trying to tell them, but they couldn't listen. Okay, so quickly, another one here. I think, to me, this is almost like a comic relief story here. So now we're, after the Garden of Gethsemane, this Roman cohort and the temple guards and a big crowd comes with clubs and swords to arrest Jesus. And so Jesus is there with his disciples. They are way outnumbered. But Peter's just said, I'm the man, so I'm going to do something. So there's this Roman cohort, they're trained military guys, the temple guard. So Peter, let's just pick up the story. Peter then, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put away the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" So what Peter does is he's way outnumbered, all these soldiers here, so he finds the weakest, most vulnerable, untrained person and says, well, I'm going to go after that one. And he has a sword, and so a couple scenarios. One is he's really cool and collected and skillful, and he goes up to the high priest and he just like lobs off his ear. I mean, that's one scenario. Another scenario is he goes, starts swinging it around, misses the high priest, lobs off his ear. I don't know really what happened, but Jesus like picks up his ear and sticks it back on and says, Peter, listen, remember in the Garden of Gethsemane when I was praying that this cup would pass? You need to just accept the fact that this is going to happen. So, all right. So then what happens is everybody scatters. The 12 disciples that all said they'd never leave him, they all scatter. So at least Peter has a little bit of courage to secretly watch where they took him, went into Caiaphas' house, and sneaks up and says, now Peter, okay. There we go. Oh, let's see, here we go. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtroom, and a servant girl came to him and said, you too were with Jesus, the Galilean. But he denied it before all of them, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, this man was with Jesus. And he denied it with an oath, saying, I don't know this man. One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, didn't I see you in the garden with him? Peter denied it again. And in another one of the Gospels, it says Peter was calling down curses on himself. So what I'm imagining is Peter is yelling, I don't know him, blankety blank. And Jesus, who's in the house, hears Peter yelling, looks out the window. This is what it says in Luke. It says, I'm getting ahead of myself. Immediately the rooster crows, and Peter remembered the words which Jesus said, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And then in Luke, it says Jesus turned and looked at him. What look was on Jesus' face? And they made eye contact. So Peter remembers what Jesus said, looks through the window, their eyes are locked. Can you imagine the pain that Jesus was in at this point in time? So what happened previously is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has his 3 best friends. He says, listen, guys, this is the hardest thing in my life. Can you be with me? And they went to sleep on him. He came back a second time. They let him down. A third time, they're still so he was really hurt when he asked for it. He was in the most vulnerable place he'd ever been. He asked for the help, and they let him down. And now his man, Peter, denies him 3 times. And I just can't imagine how painful that would be for Jesus. And so Peter is held accountable in a sense by facing Jesus. And he just went out and he wept bitterly. And this thing that he said he would never do, that's the very thing that he did. And I can't imagine all the things that are going on in Peter and all of the self-doubt. And it's like, okay, I'm supposed to be leading this church, and Jesus just promised me that I'd be judging one of the 12, and I just disqualified myself. I just blew it. And I think a big issue here was his identity. It's like, having made this mistake, who am I? And should I even, what's my future here? And so I think Peter thought he was done. And so the next passage we're going to look at is in John 21, where this is after Jesus was raised from the dead, and Peter says, I'm going fishing. So if you remember, they left their boats. Jesus said, from now on, you will be fishing for men. This is your new job. And what does Peter say? I'm going fishing. So some of his friends join him. They fish all night. Don't catch a thing. Daybreak, they see this guy on the shore. Couldn't make him out. He says, hey, how was fishing last night? Well, we got skunked. Didn't catch a thing all night. So then this guy says, well, why don't you put down your nets? Just see what happens. So they put down their nets, and I'm guessing Peter's going, this is deja vu all over again. I mean, do you remember when we had this same thing at the beginning, where we had the same thing, and it was Jesus, and we figured out that he was the Messiah? So they lower their nets down, get this huge haul. Turns out it's 153 really big fish. And all of a sudden they realize, this guy on the shore, that's Jesus. So Jesus says, well, got these fish, let's have some breakfast. And then after breakfast, they had a little conversation. When they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know I love you. He said, tend my lambs. Then he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, shepherd my sheep. And then he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. And Jesus said, tend my sheep. So what's going on here? So couple things. One is there's a rupture in Peter's relationship with Jesus, and that had to be repaired. Another thing is Peter just messed up, and like how are we going to deal with this? And I believe the fact that Peter said, I'm going fishing, is an indication that he thought he was done. And so this is his little come to Jesus meeting. And so it's interesting. I mean, so Peter had just done this thing that he adamantly said he would never do. And now this is the next time he's facing Jesus and having a conversation with him. So what did Jesus do? He said, do you love me? Let's go back to our relationship. Let's start at the big picture. Are we still good in our relationship? And so he asked Peter the question, which basically means that Peter needed to say, yep, I love you. And Peter denied Jesus 3 times. 3 in the scriptures is the number of wholeness and completion, like the Trinity's kind of complete right there. So he really denied him, and then 3 times he's saying, do you love me? And by the 3rd time, Peter was like, don't you get it? Well, it needed to be 3 times because he denied him 3 times. So he starts with the relationship. Let's keep the relationship first. Let's not talk about what's wrong. Let's start with, do we love each other? And then he said, feed my sheep. Be the shepherd that I've called you. So, a lot of people call this the reinstatement. Like, you're still okay. Just because you blew it didn't disqualify you. So, in life, we're all going to make a lot of mistakes because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. But the interesting thing about this dynamic is that Jesus affirmed Peter's true self. He didn't get off. So there's this false self that the flesh, we make mistakes, but he was focusing on, Peter, this is who you really are. What's really important is we love each other. I still see you as this amazing, glorious person, and I'm calling you into that. So when we mess up, we got to do repair. But the thing I learned from this is the way that Jesus did repair is he said, let's focus first on the relationship, and then I'm going to focus on the fact that this is who I see who you are, your best possible self, and I'm just going to call that out. And I'm going to believe in you, and even though you messed up, I still have confidence in you and telling you that I want you to feed my sheep. Okay, so wrapping this up, let's kind of look at some key points here. Key points on failure. We're human. We mess up on a regular basis, don't we? And the Spirit is willing. We have good hearts. We sincerely want to do the right things. But way more often than we'd like, we mess up. And Jesus seemed to be okay with that. And when I say seem to be okay, I'm not saying that that's a license to act badly, but we mess up. And so it's very significant that Jesus went out of his way twice to tell the disciples in advance, you're going to mess up. Because it's like he wanted them to say, I know it's going to happen, and I'm okay with it. And I'm going to still love you and accept you. Another point is sometimes we got blind spots. Just because we don't see that we have, that's the definition of a blind spot, right? Just because we don't think we have a problem doesn't mean we don't. It starts off with them thinking they're the greatest. What was Jesus thinking? Like, these guys are just talking about how great they are, and my response is, oh, by the way, you're all going to leave me. You guys that think you're great. And so, we have blind spots. That's okay. Another point is that I really do think that Jesus was hurt badly by Peter. but he was able to hold that. He wasn't all ticked off at Peter. He didn't say, okay, you're done. So let's talk about key points on relational repair. How was it that Jesus was able to still be relational with Peter after he was so offended by him? I think that as Jesus was looking at both his brokenness and his glory, that he was saying, okay, yes, he did this thing because the flesh took over. Yes, I realize that Satan incited him. I mean, I don't know all the things, but I mean, I just think Satan was influential in Peter seizing up with fear and denying him. I mean, he was afraid of a servant girl. I mean, not that, I mean, I don't want to demean the servant girl, but I mean, she wasn't a powerful person, but Peter was afraid of her and what she would think of him. Okay, so to me, there's something that wasn't logical. There was some demonic influence going on that Jesus actually gave Peter a heads up on. So, but that was Peter's false self. And Jesus was able to say, yep, Peter wasn't acting according. That wasn't the real Peter. Peter messed up. And I'm still choosing to focus on the real Peter. Tim talks about seeing people by the Spirit. And that was a key point in Jesus being able to have this discussion with Peter to restore him. You know, one of the names for Satan is the accuser of the brethren. And so we are influenced to be in enemy mode, and when people mess up, it's easy for us to just fixate, to adopt this same spirit of Satan and accuse them and judge them. You know, mercy triumphs over judgment, but man, that's hard. It's just so easy to judge. And so that is a key thing for ourselves to remember when we have conflict with others, is instead of judging, how do we see people as God created them to be? Jesus made the relationship bigger than the problem. He didn't focus on what Peter did wrong. So if we can extend grace to other people, like Jesus did to Peter, that would be amazing. So, not if we fail, we will fail. We are going to mess up. And when we mess up, it oftentimes usually creates relational problems. And so, that's all right. We can repair. And so we are people who repair when we mess up. That's part of what we're learning as a body, that's what we do. Okay, so as often we do, we're going to break up into groups of 3 to 5 people, and let's just talk about this. So there's 3 questions here. What did you learn today as we looked at this whole story of Peter messing up? What did you learn today about how to handle failures in your own life? What did you learn about how to handle failures in others' lives? And what did you learn about relational repair? So if you're new here, what we'll do is we'll just break up into groups of 3 to 5 people. It can be people sitting around you. It can be anybody. And you don't have to share anything more. You don't need to share your deep, darkest, own personal failures, or anything like that. But yeah, it would just be good to interact and say, well, what did I learn today, and share that with others. And when you're done in a few minutes, we're dismissed.